Hey everybody, Andy from Tennis Euphoria, and I have some questions for you. Have you ever considered racket head shape and the implications on sweet spot? Have you ever noticed that you play better with particular racket head shapes? Have you ever considered where you typically make contact ball to strings, and has that ever transcended over to racket decisions that you've ever made? Well, I think this is quite an interesting subject, and as I've been squirreling away working on quite an in-depth consultation process around understanding people's movement patterns, muscle memory, layering over some strength and conditioning and fitness principles, as well as looking at people's technique and typical connection points on rackets to understand what racket is best for them, the patterns that I'm finding is that there can be a correlation between where someone naturally connects with the ball and what racket can be right for them in terms of optimal response and hitting the sweet spot. And of course, rackets are engineered with slightly different sweet spots. The gravity, for example, is all about sweet spot, and that is quite extended and lifted up on a racket. And when you read and research about sweet spots, it's generally accepted that sweet spots can vary and that the racket head shape can have an impact on where that optimal response, as I like to describe it, is based on a racket. To take some very basic examples, if you were to look at an isometric head shape, for example, then that sweet spot can be a little bit higher and fanned out compared to something that is more traditional and circular or kind of boxish sort of beam. Yonex isometric shapes, for example, the sweet spot arguably could be a bit bigger, but typically I also find that optimal response point can be a little bit higher. So if we were to look at myself and some considerations and some patterns that are definitely there. So my connection point is typically in the center of a racket. I think that's all through muscle memory and technique. This backhand shot is actually a little bit rare. More commonly, I'm hitting the ball in the center and a little bit below the center, a bit closer to the throat. And that does transcend to both forehand and backhand, and regardless of sort of cross court or down the line hitting, whatever angles, that seems to be my common contact point. And what's quite interesting is that I get on much better with circular shaped rackets, can get on quite well with things like the TF40, which is, I guess, a sort of mixture between circular and box, and I struggle to enjoy the benefits of Yonex isometric shapes. I struggle a little bit with the gravity as well, and that actually makes a lot of sense to me. So I can play, for example, with the Prince 93P and feel like the racket is quite forgiving with a generous sweet spot. I can also play with sort of 98s that are quite circular, and it can feel to me like it's 100 square inches. I can also find that I can hit with a Yonex racket, and because I'm not connecting at its optimal point, I'm connecting just below that, sometimes I can sense some vibrations, and it can be a little bit challenging on my wrist and arm. And I think that goes some way to explain why some people will find some Yonex frames uncomfortable, whilst probably a large majority of modern players will find that actually they are comfortable. It all comes down to connecting with the racket based on your technique at the optimal point within the racket. So I think it's a really interesting subject. Would love your thoughts. As you probably have noticed, I've been hitting the shift, and I'll review that over the next 24 hours, so subscribe to see that. Any comments on this subject I'd be really grateful of. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.